So this is our presentation of Beasts of the Southern Wild by Marcel Owen and me. Hurricane Katrina was one of the worst natural disasters in America and that mostly affected minority groups such as poor, black, and elderly residents. The lack of initiative via the government's response severely impacted the lives of those groups, ultimately causing more damage than help. The hurricane occurred August 23rd, 2005 through August 31st. Hurricane Katrina was the largest and third strongest hurricane ever recorded to make landfall in the US, with New Orleans being the most severely affected. Levees were designed for Category 3 storms, but Katrina peaked at Category 5 with winds speeds up to 175 miles per hour. The storm affected 15 million people, caused more than an estimated $161 billion worth of damage, 1,800 deaths, and impacted 90,000 square feet of territory from central Florida to eastern Texas. Who was affected the most? Katrina pummeled huge parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. The most damage occurred in New Orleans. The most disadvantaged population suffered the worst harm from the disaster. Many Black Americans and poor individuals were unable to evacuate, with Black neighborhoods being the worst severely damaged. The government did little to nothing to help evacuate people before the hurricane hit. Local, state, and federal officials were simply too slow in helping largely poor Black populations, leaving them stranded. The inadequate response at the time of Katrina led to more deaths that could have been avoided, especially among impoverished minority communities. How power profits from disaster. Naomi Klein details the history of large corporations and their power hungry and corporate ways of profiting from disaster, seizing the atmosphere of crisis to push through any unpopular or pro corporate policies, essentially using their ability to help people gain something politically or advance their corporation further. After crisis, private contractors move in and snuck funding for work done badly, if at all. Then those billions get cut from government budgets like Grenfell Tower. Hurricane Katrina revealed a disdain for the poor. The research showed that virtually any tumultuous situation, if framed with sufficient hysteria by political leaders, could serve this softening up function. It could be an event as radical as a military coup, but the economic shock of a market or a budget crisis could also do the trick. Amid hyperinflation or banking collapse, for instance, the country's governing elites were frequently able to sell a panicked population on the necessity for a tax on social protections or enormous bailouts to prop up the financial private sector, because the alternative, they claimed, was outright economic apocalypse. How disaster affects minority communities. It took FEMA 5 days to get water, food to people in New Orleans who had sought emergency shelter in the Superdome. People helped each other as best they could. They rescued each other in canoes and rowboats. They fed each other. Many stayed because they had no choice, they didn't have a car, or were too ill to drive. Those are the people who needed a functioning system of evacuation and relief the most, and they had little to no help. Abandoned in the city without food or water, those in need did whatever they had to do in those circumstances. They took provisions from local stores. Fox News and other media outlets seized on this to paint New Orleans black residents as dangerous looters who would soon be coming to invade the dry, white parts of the city and surrounding suburbs and towns. Buildings were spray painted with messages like looters will be shot.
Hello, and I will be taking you through Klein's piece, Let Them Drown. She first describes a general disconnect between Western environmentalists and the reality of those experiencing acute climate change. Klein cites the critique of a colleague of Said, Rob Nixon, as he says that environmentalism is the indulgence of spoiled tree huggers who lack a proper cause. These environmentalists have not experienced what many in the Middle East have and are not as immersed in the geopolitics of the area, Klein says. She also says that since climate change works in the medium term, many lose sight over much more pressing short term matters like war and military occupations. Another issue of this disconnect comes in the form of green colonialism. Described as land grabbing by organizations for an ostensibly green cause, it cuts off natives from their ancestral lands. This greatly hinders their interaction with their cultural area and represents a type of colonialism that erases their cultures. It occurs throughout Israel and much of the Americas. A harsher reality of this is the abuse that natives experience when they attempt to re-enter their land. Physical abuse at the hands of park rangers and security often occur in these situations. In a similar connection to their land, many show what Said called samud. Climate samud is a word that Klein describes as steadfast refusal to leave one's land despite the most desperate eviction attempts and even when surrounded by continuous danger. There's a deep connection that people experience with their land despite it being a dangerous area or a sacrifice zone. Klein cites this as a type of climate resilience as well, as many blockade coal ships in Australia and demand more aggressive climate action than what is currently being given.
Okay, I will be talking about how power profits from disaster and how that links to Beast of the Southern Wild. So the movie quotes will be in yellow and the article quotes will be in white. Starting with a quote from the article: people helped each other as best they could. They rescued each other in canoes and rowboats. They fed each other. They displayed that beautiful human capacity for solidarity that moments of crisis so often intensify. But at the official level, it was the complete opposite. So we see this in Beast of the Southern Wild when Wink and Hushpuppi look for members of the bathtub after the storm. They get in their boat and they start looking around to see if there's any survivors of those people who did stay back. Those who stayed back from the storm rebuilt and celebrated each other through community meals and rebuilding the bathtub together. We also see an example of how it failed at the official level, where the people of the bathtub were forced out of their homes after the storm, and they were then relocated to a FEMA-like hospital. Another quote that I pulled from How Power Profits from Disaster is: imagine being forced to leave your home, having to sleep in a camping bed in some Carvinist convention center, and then finding out that the people who are supposed to represent you are claiming this is some sort of divine intervention. God apparently really likes condo development. Now, this was a quote when Klein was talking about one of the congressmen who had said that, quote, they finally found a way to take care of the Louisiana housing issue, which we all know is a terrible thing to say. And we can see that how this is kind of portrayed in when Wink and Hushpuppi go to the hospital scene, and Hushpuppi says it didn't look like a prison, it looked more like a fish tank with no water. Hence that they weren't prisoners, they were just people who were suffering and who were provided just care and nothing else. Comparing Let Them Drown to Beasts of the Southern Wild, we have a quote that says, as a result, the carbon offset market has created a whole new class of green human rights abuses, with farmers and indigenous people being physically attacked by park rangers or private security when they try to access these lands. We see this when Wink and Hushpuppi are forced out of their homes by the first responders. And there's also other examples where we see that they also forced other members of the bathtub out using strong force. This removes them. They would not take no for an answer, and they forcibly removed the people of the bathtub from their homeland. A quote from Let Them Drown is the popularized Arabic word samad, to stay put, to hold on, that steadfast refusal to leave one's land despite the most desperate eviction attempts and even when surrounded by continuous danger. We see examples of this and all throughout the community of the bathtub, strongly in Wink's beliefs and his ability to fix everything that seems to go wrong for Hushpuppi, the bathtub, and himself. We also see this in the community when many of them choose to stay back instead of leaving when the storm comes. And then a few discussion questions to think about. Do you think the film would be completely different if they included Black issues? Why or why not? Use specific examples from the article. Is Climate Samad actually accurately represented in the film by the characters? How so? And does Climate Samad help or hurt the characters in the bathtub? What role does it play in Wink's character?